Hello. Okay, let's start our conference, and it's a very big honor for us to have John Cochrane from Chicago Business School to be talking to us today. So the time is very tight today because right after the talk he needs to leave to the airport. So I think I won't spend too much time on talking about all the accomplishments, contributions that John has made. So I'll just briefly mention that, using the terminology I liked yesterday from his lecture, I think he spent a lot of effort of turning finance from this chaos state into this well-structured state where we understand why certain asset commands the risk premium or why the expected return behaves in the way it does. And another thing I want to mention is that I think John is kind of microfinance person. And yesterday we saw the finance side, and I think today what we are going to hear is more of a macroeconomic side. And so let me not take any more of your time, and please welcome John Cochrane, who will be talking about the fiscal theory of the price level.
So let's do this by class rules, not talk rules. So ask questions. If anything isn't immediately clear, raise your hand. Make sure we do it, because there's absolutely no point in sitting here lost. Okay? So stretch, practice, ready to ask questions, rather than just listen to me chat. Okay, we're frozen here. Why not? Yeah. Well, we're going to start by rebooting the computer. That seems to work. Okay, well, we got something that works. The basic question I'm after here, and in this line of research, is what determines the price level. So I want to go back to absolute basics. The first question of macroeconomics, where does the price level and hence inflation come from? And I want to view this as a foundational question. What's the simple, all of our models, we start with something simple and then we build on it with frictions and habits and other stuff to get the dynamics right. But what's the absolute simplest bottom of everything part of any model, what determines the price level? They say, oh my gosh, why did I get up at 9 in the morning for this? We've known that, but actually no. That's actually kind of a gaping hole in macro theory. Let me see. So you might have said, duh, you're from Chicago, right? So isn't it MV equals PY? It actually, Milton Friedman actually had that as his license plates, by the way. So inflation is too much money chasing too few goods, right? We all know that. Well, not obviously. That's a nice theory, but the question is, does it apply to us? And there's two big problems with it. One is, what's money? I've actually survived in Russia for a couple days with none of it. Or as Marie Antoinette once famously said, let them use credit cards. Do unused credit card balances count as money? Well, who knows? Deeper than that, the big problem is that for MV equals PY to determine the price level, the central bank has to control the quantity of M. If the central bank sets an interest rate target, we all, every good monetarist says, well, that's going to explode. You're going to have hyperinflation. No, that doesn't work. Our central banks are interest rate targets. So our goal is, what determines the price level in a fiat money economy in which the central bank is following an interest rate target? And MV equals PY doesn't work. Furthermore, MV equals PY only works if money demand is not interest elastic. Once money demand is interest elastic, MV of I equals PY, then you got multiple equilibria again, and you're toast. It doesn't work. Well, you might ask Ben Bernanke, where does inflation come from? Reading the FOMC minutes is good. It lets you know how the Fed thinks about things. They kind of have this mechanistic view that they set interest rates, short rates determine long rates, a rise in long rates dampens demand, whatever that is. Demand leads to bigger gaps or slack, and slack or gaps lead to inflation. There's a Phillips curve. So first of all, there's not much support for that empirically. I'll show you later. Second, there's not really any economics in that, right? So inflation is, well, at best we're determining inflation. Prices come from whatever prices were yesterday, and then they get nudged up and down by this Phillips curve. And there's no economics to it either. I mean, this is a causal chain that there's really precious little economics. It's kind of sad if that is ultimately the simplest theory of where inflation comes from. There's a new Keynesian model out there. It goes kind of an opposite direction. It says that if inflation goes up, the Fed raises interest rates, but that doesn't work the way you think it does. In the equations of the new Keynesian model, that makes inflation explode. So what the Fed does not do is stabilize the economy. In the new Keynesian model, the Fed threatens to hyperinflate the economy for anything but one initial value of inflation, and if we don't all jump to that, we're in trouble. Well, that theory has obvious problems too. There's lots and lots of other possible theories. Gold standard, commodity standard, but they don't apply to us. So we kind of have a gaping hole here, which is one place I like to think of, the fiscal theory. So those are the other theories that don't work. Maybe I should talk about the theory that I'm here to talk about today. Here it is. The central idea of the fiscal theory is the nominal value of government debt divided by price level is the present value of real primary surpluses. So I'm going to investigate a very simple model. BT minus 1 is one period government debt sold yesterday, coming due today. That's the face value debt the government has to pay off today. MT minus 1 is outstanding money, if there is any. E is the price level. S is primary surpluses, so that's taxes minus expenditures, not counting interest payments and the present value. So that's you can see this is the theory of finance kind of imperialistically going after theory of macroeconomics. But that's in fact true. When you look at the accounting, nominal debt is a claim on the primary surpluses. So nominal debt is like stock in the government. And that's a way to think of how this equation operates. Suppose you wake up and you discover on the right, surpluses, what surpluses? Your government's bankrupt. What are you going to do? Well, wake up and fast, try to get rid of government debt, right? Because that government debt is they're going to default on it sooner or later. Why not be the first one out? Well, the only way we can all get rid of government debt is by buying stuff, right? Government debt's like a hot potato. Maturing government debt and money, all you can do is try to give it to someone else to buy something. So you get aggregate demand. And that is exactly, there's a kind of a budget constraint. The only way any of us can buy more of everything is by getting rid of government debt and vice versa. So this isn't, this is an area where learning to feel in the equations is important. So there's nothing magic about it. If there isn't enough surplus out there, you'll try to get rid of government debt. That is too much goods, too much debt and money chasing too few goods and services. That'll drive up the price level. There's also, so if you were there last night for the discount rate, there's another possibility which is, I think, very interesting. Suppose that your expectations of future surpluses stay the same, but you discount them at a lower rate. So interest rates go down, risk premium on government debt goes down, R goes down. Now R goes down acts exactly as S going up, and therefore that's a deflationary force, lowering of aggregate demand. That's kind of my story for what happened in the financial crisis. There was a flight to quality. People were willing to hold government debt despite no change. I mean, if anything, bad news about surpluses, but they're willing to hold government debt at a lower rate of return. What does that do? That raises the right-hand side. So we got to lower the price level. That's a deflationary force. So a flight to quality lowers aggregate demand. That's this gives you a way of thinking about exactly that event. Another way of thinking about it theoretically is just like stock. Suppose that the way we operated our economy was we used Microsoft stock as money. So if I wanted to buy a bottle, I would deliver one share of Microsoft stock and vice versa. That's numeraire, unit of account, all those things. Well, if that was how we did things, then all of us would say our theory of the price level is simple. the number one question is, what's the present value of Microsoft's dividends? That's the value of this piece of paper that I exchanged for a bottle of water. Well, same thing. When you look at the accounting, debt is a claim to government surpluses. So that's a nice way of thinking about inflation. Now you may look at this equation. You've all been too polite. I asked for questions and nobody did. But if you were in a Chicago mood and had your coffee, you'd go, surpluses? What surpluses? Now the U.S. government's been in deficit as long as you've been alive, and pretty much me too. But remember, what goes on the right-hand side here is primary surpluses. Surpluses net of interest cost. So here's the plot of the U.S. Real primary surpluses. And in fact, it's an interesting plot. First of all, it sometimes is above the zero line. So much of our reported deficit is interest payments on outstanding debt. And the government, being an infinitely lived agent, so long as it's paying its interest, then the debt to GDP ratio won't explode. So it counts, running a deficit that pays off just less than your interest is still running a primary surplus, and you won't explode. And you kind of see actually an interesting pattern here. In the 1960s, we were running decent surpluses. Interestingly, the outbreak of deficits in the U.S. was first 73 and 75 oil crisis. Look at that. Look at 1975. It's an absolutely horrible year for deficits. I mean, if you had only seen data up to here, you might say, whoa, we're in trouble. It's kind of interesting that 75 was the outbreak of serious inflation in the U.S. Now, one of my projects, undone, but I'd like to do it soon, is to try to explain the inflation and disinflation of the 70s and 80s in this framework. But you can see it's not hopeless. Then in 1980, where supposedly, the usual story is the Federal Reserve conquered inflation. In fact, there was also, in 1980, another thing that happened was there was big tax reform. It led to a period of enormous growth in the U.S. economy, and it led to surpluses. Believe it or not, there was a time in the late 1990s where we were talking about what would happen when the U.S. government made so much money it had retired all of its debt. And what would we do? Well, those days are long gone. Here's the current surplus. The technical word for that is a cliff. And you can see why I am worried about inflation. My worry about inflation has nothing to do with the Fed and Bernanke and is he tough enough? We have a problem. Now let me show you a little more detail of a very simple model to try and really understand where this idea comes from and what it means. There's a lot of controversy surrounding the fiscal theory, and it's just amazing because this equation on a mathematical level is trivial. And then people write all sorts of papers where they froth at the mouth and get mad at each other about how the simple equation works. I think going back to a one-period model makes it very, very clear what's going on. So think of a world where there's bonds and money that are held overnight, and then you wake up in the morning. Now, what a bond is it says the U.S. government will give me $1 if I give them one bond. So you wake up in the morning, and the first thing you do is you redeem any outstanding bonds for money. You can use that money for trading during the day. And by the end of the day, though, you have to pay taxes to the government. And the rule is you have to give them money. You have to give them the government's own money for taxes, right? And then this is a one-period model, so the dashed line, there is no, nothing, the world ends. So one-period models are nice because you don't get lost in transversality conditions and off equilibrium. It's just very clear what's going to happen. The world's going to end. So you can figure out very quickly the equilibrium condition in this economy, which is here's the claims coming in. That turns into money during the day, and then that has to be soaked up in taxes at the end of the day. There's no reason whatsoever for you. So, as your priest told you, you can't take it with you. The world's going to end. So, the equilibrium condition is make sure you give all that stuff to the government. If you don't, you're being stupid because you could go out for one last shot of vodka before you give it to the government. So there's goods and services you could have. That's the equilibrium condition. So the equilibrium condition, all the money coming in has to get soaked up by tax payments at the end of the day. And that is an equilibrium condition. It's not a budget constraint. This thing is often called the government budget constraint, and that's completely wrong. It's not a budget constraint. There's nothing, if you decide you're going to try to take it with you and stuff it in your pocket, there's nothing that stops, that's not a constraint on the government. Sure, you can do it. It's an equilibrium condition that you will choose to use that money on one last shot of vodka before the world ends, right? So that's not, that's what this is a condition that determines the price level. If towards the end of the day you find you've got too much money relative to the amount you have to pay in taxes, you're going to go out and, you're going to drive up the price of vodka because there's only so much vodka left. This is the last day of the world, right? So that's how it works in a one-period model, and you can see fundamentally, why is money value? Why is these pieces of paper? I do have some in there. I have some dollars. It's a piece of paper. It's worth nothing. It cost 1/10 of a cent for the government to make. Why is it that I can use this to buy things? Well, the fiscal theory of the price level has an answer to that question. And the answer is fundamentally because the government takes this and only this for taxes. And that's the fundamental thing determining, the puzzle of economics is why we're willing to give up valuable goods and services for pieces of paper. Now, you can see also this one-period example is useful. Where does inflation come from? Well, we have this idea of money causes inflation, and that is true in this little model, right? Towards the end of the world, there's kind of too much money chasing too few goods, if that's what's going to drive the price level up. Too much aggregate demand. It feels perfectly normal. There's nothing strange about this world. But there's nothing the Fed can do about it. Right? The government has to redeem the outstanding debt for money. So there is a sense, if you'd like, in which you notice too much money chasing too few goods here. But there's nothing a central bank can do about it. This is maturing government debt. They have to redeem it. So the central bank would be forced to monetize the deficits here. Fundamentally, inflation here is coming from too much outstanding debt and not enough taxes. Now, so where did this present value thing come from? It comes from rolling over the short-term debt. So let's, the second, a more realistic model is at the end of the day, here's the money coming in, the outstanding bonds and money. So what happens to that? The government has to redeem it in the morning. Then in the afternoon, some of that money gets soaked up in tax payments. But the government can also issue new bonds. Right? So the money floating around will get soaked up in tax payments, but it also gets soaked up. The government will take back the money and issue new debt. And that's the amount of new debt that the government will, that's the amount of money, the value of the new debt times the face value of the debt sold. Well, now just iterate everything forward, right? Well, that BT is going to come in the next period ahead. We're just going to iterate one period forward. All I did here is multiply and divide by PT plus 1. And then this BT over PT plus 1 is tomorrow's expected surplus plus the amount of debt sold the next day. Rolling short-term debt forward is where you get this present value relationship. Now let's back up to theory just a little bit. There are two conditions in all monetary models. Here's what I've written down here is the continuous time version. It's now MTBT, but those are predetermined. Those are determined 1 second before time t. And there's the continuous time present value of future surpluses. So all monetary models consist of something. There's nothing new about the fiscal theory, really. We're just reading it differently. Every monetary model has this equation in it somewhere. Usually it's deep down in a footnote. But this is an equilibrium condition for any model. The real value of nominal debt must equal the present value of future surpluses. That's an equilibrium condition that has to hold in every model, along with most monetary models spend their time on this or an interest rate target or something else. So what do they do with equation 1? Well, if you look deep into the footnotes of any proper monetary model, they see something about Ricardian regime, lump sum taxes, blah, blah, blah. What they do is they neatly get rid of that equilibrium condition by assuming that the price level is set over here. And then in the second stage, the government commits itself to whatever the price level comes out from money, it will ex post raise or lower taxes enough to make that equation hold. In other words, we get rid of a really nice equilibrium condition by just assuming that there's a causal chain, starts here and goes there. Now, conversely, a sort of a fiscal analysis, you can make it very stylized and think of the price levels determined here, and then the second equation follows. And in fact, when we think about what central bankers say, that's often how they behave. They say, well, we provide enough liquidity to determine whatever. Well, that's exactly following this equation here. They're simply saying, well, whatever P is, we provide enough M to make the economy work. Well, that's what central bankers do and have been criticized for generations for doing. Let's take them at their word, but if so, where does the price level come from? Well, that chain allows us to think about it. Now let's go back to the regime where, prices are set here, we get a really tough central bank, and then the government follows over here. One of the big fallacies is to think the government must do so, but not necessarily. So suppose, Bernanke decides he's going to cut the price level in half. We're going to run a big deflation, cut the price level in half. So in this monetary dominant or Ricardian regime, he says, okay, we're cutting the price level in half. Now, if we cut the price level in half, that means that $13 trillion of outstanding debt is now $26 trillion of real outstanding debt. So Bernanke just calls up his friend Geithner and says, hey, Tim, old buddy, I need you to double taxes because we need to double the amount we're going to pay off those rich bondholders, right? Those bondholders were due $1 real worth of stuff. They now have to get $2 real worth of stuff. So could you please double taxes in order for us to follow a Ricardian regime? Well, you're chuckling enough to know that might not happen. And what I want to point out is that is a possibility, but it's not necessarily true. So,
excuse me.
Please.
When I think about putting this theory to the United States, it works in where is China here?
I'm sorry?
Where is China here?
China is somebody who's holding a lot of this B stuff.
Yeah, and it has some strange, might be equilibrium, but very different equilibrium condition in terms of rationality. Because they care about something different. And they might be the force that keeps price level in the United States quite stable. Because the expectations might be different. They have tau equals 0 somewhere in the future, so they can play as well.
Well, the equilibrium condition is there. What you're suggesting is that there is perhaps a way to think about it in this context is that they're willing to hold it at a very low rate of return, which is, we sold them $1 trillion of treasuries, and then we devalued the dollar, so they could buy about as half as many BMWs with it as before. Then they bought another $1 trillion of treasuries, and we're about to do it again. So they certainly seem to be willing to hold it for a low rate of return.
But their objectives are different.
Yeah, their objectives are different, but this condition holds. I mean, it's an accounting identity, really. So our question is about what the rate of return that the marginal investor is willing to hold. Right. So I would put this as you using the fiscal theory. So what you just advanced is a thought about why is U.S. not having inflation now, even though we printed up like $1 trillion worth of reserves. The news on this is absolutely catastrophic. Why are we not having inflation? Well, you've discovered an agent who's willing to hold all this debt, and you're thinking in those terms, and so welcome to the club. Now, this, you may be saying, blah, 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 this is kind of all boring, but when the fiscal condition operates, when the way the world is working is the top equation is really in charge of the price level, and the Fed's doing what it's doing, many classic doctrines of monetary economics are quite different. So let's start with one classic doctrine. So an open market operation is an exchange of money for debt. The Fed does not print money and give it up. What central banks do is they buy debt back and issue money, or buy money back and issue debt. this is a very deep, different fact that you have to keep in mind when you think about monetary economics. We do not distribute money by helicopters. We always buy debt and give money, or buy money and give debt. So what are the effects of an open market operation? Quiz, top equation. If the government lowers M and raises B by exactly the same amount, what happens to the price level? Nothing, right? I've taken red M&Ms, I've given you green M&Ms. It makes no difference whatsoever. Well, that's interesting. That's really different. These fiscal forces are pushing inflation around in a way that standard open market operations just say nothing about. Second, monetary economists for years have complained about central bank policies that don't control the money supply. For example, they have interest rate targets. They supply enough liquidity to meet the needs of trade. The real bills doctrine is something, so the real bills doctrine said the central bank can just stand ready, and anytime somebody gives it a good security, it can issue money in exchange. Lend to anybody who wants to against good collateral. That's not inflationary. So that's a classic fallacy in usual monetary thinking, because you've increased the money supply, that's going to increase inflation. Here, no problem whatsoever, because what matters is in a real bills exchange, which you've taken and you've reduced the amount of debt, but the government has an asset that can then pay off the. You've taken in an asset that can pay off that government debt anytime you feel like it. Inside money, we're taught that it's very important for the government to control M1, to not let banks expand the money supply. Well, all that counts in the top equation is government notes. So Microsoft stock, its price is unaffected if Dimitri sells me an option. By selling me an option, he's creating artificial shares, but those are inside money. Microsoft says, I don't care about that stuff. I only have to pay off the real ones. Same thing here. What counts is the amount of debt, of government debt and government money, the money base. If we then have inside contracts, which pay off in government money, that doesn't matter at all for the price level. Whereas M1 is what goes in there, and the classic monetarist thinking says that controlling inside money is very important. By the way, the M can go to zero. This is the part I love the most. A lot of people worry about, as we go to a cashless economy, the central bank will lose control of the price level. Because if MD equals PY has a zero on the left side, well, we got a 0 over 0 problem, and what do? Well, no problem here. We can go to a completely cashless economy, which I kind of like. So we can run our economy on electronic claims to maturing treasury bills, and that will cause no problem for the price level. In fiscal theory, well, of course, standard monetary economics has big problems with that. In fact, let's go back to think about, you might think of the gold standard as working a perfect way of determining the price level. Well, as a fiscal theorist, I now am like a 2-year-old with a hammer to which everything looks like a nail. Yes, please.
M is 0, how the second quantity will work?
Well, M is, so suppose V goes to infinity. So M is 0, V goes to infinity. Or M is 0, government monetary base goes to 0 and there's inside claims. That's one way of doing it. Right. But I don't care about the second equation. No, actually, I'm sorry. M goes to 0 as we move to an economy where we can do all of our transactions by credit card or electronic claims to money market mutual funds or something of the sort. That is, in fact, V going to infinity. We don't need any transactions to manage anymore. So fine. That would normally cause problems. That doesn't cause any problems for us. Let's go back and think about the gold standard, or a currency board, or an exchange rate peg. We've long thought of those as ways, okay, that's a theory of the price level, but at least it may not apply to the U.S. or to Russia, but it at least is theoretically coherent. But in fact, if you want to, pegs always have the problem that there's a speculative attack, if you will. Gold standards have the problem that the government runs out of gold. In order to run one of these, to have a gold standard, you need the gold, or you need the taxing ability to get the gold when you want it. if we're going to say something else determines the price level and then the Ricardian regime happens, well, for that to work, you need the taxes. And in fact, come to think of it, if you're running a peg, it's thought you need reserves, but you don't need any reserves at all. You need the ability to borrow reserves. And where does the ability to borrow reserves come from? It comes from your ability to tax in the future. So in some sense, it's always the fiscal theory. Even in this supposedly easy Ricardian regime, what really matters is the ability to raise future taxes, if need be, to defend your commitment to the price level. Now, there's some other features of finance that are important. What I've talked about so far is nominal debt. And nominal debt, the key to nominal debt is that if the government runs out of resources, taxing resources, it can inflate it away, and will inflate it away. What I've assumed is if the U.S. government, runs out of, not the ability, if the U.S. government essentially never solves its deficit problem, what we will end up doing is we won't default on the debt, we'll inflate the debt, because we have this wonderful ability to borrow in our own currency. Suppose you've borrowed in a foreign currency, though. Well, if you've borrowed in a foreign currency, now P is set. Greece cannot on its own inflate the euro. Greece must pay off its debts or default. So nominal debt is equity. Nominal debt adjusts the price level, adjusts to any lack of future surpluses. Real or foreign currency debt is debt. Price does not adjust, you either pay it off or you default. So there's an interesting, almost corporate finance aspect to it. Do you borrow in your own currency or in foreign currencies, or how else do you create something like government equity? That, by the way, is what makes nominal debt so useful. What makes nominal debt is like equity. That's a good thing. It's actually good to be able to occasionally inflate as opposed to default. We think of there being costs of default, and we certainly saw that in the financial crisis. What was the difference of the financial crisis and the dot-com bust? We both lost a huge amount of money, but in the financial crisis there was cost of default. In the dot-com bust, it was just equities repricing. So nominal debt has a very good function. Its function is to be a buffer. Now, I've only done one period debt, and actual governments have long-term debt. So I'm expanding first to think about foreign currency debt, and second to think about long-term debt and how does that change things. Long-term debt changes things enormously. So let me take a really simple example where you can see transparently what happens. Suppose the government has a perpetuity outstanding. So the way it's borrowed a ton of money, and there's this coupon C which is due every period. So every period, people come in, they have their coupon, they say, give me stuff to the government. Well, now let's just think through our equilibrium condition. C gets redeemed every day. That much must be soaked up in taxes every day. So everything, and nothing new is sold again. Now, let me go back to, it's just like the one period world, if you will. So every period, there's nothing new sold. Every day, this coupon C comes in and has to be paid back again. Right? That's what happens if you have, where did it go? Long-term debt, here we go. If you have long-term debt, all this present value stuff evaporates. Now, the price level is determined by the amount of debt coming due every day. That's just the coupon, and the amount of surpluses to pay off that coupon every single day. What happened to the present value equation? Well, that's still here. It's still true that the real value of outstanding nominal government debt is the present value surpluses. But the real value of outstanding debt is now, it's a perpetuity, right? There's coupons that last forever. And so the price with the real value of outstanding debt is priced like so. There's the coupon and then the discount rate for each coupon. So let's think about what happens. We get news today that 10 years from now, our government is going to blow out its unentitlements. What happens? In this view of the world, when we get news today that we're going to blow out entitlements 10 years from now, you get inflation today. Short-term debt rolls all that back, and it affects inflation today. With long-term debt, if we learn that 10 years from now there's going to be a big S problem, then we know that 10 years from now there's going to be big inflation. What happens then is interest rates rise, the market value of the long-term debt declines, but we don't get any inflation now. You get inflation later. So long-term debt is a wonderful government security. It's a buffer against future shocks. Short-term debt causes financial crises. Financial crises are always and everywhere a problem of short-term debt. Why? Because when you get bad news about the long future and you're trying to roll over short-term debt, you get a financial crisis now. That's exactly what happened to Greece. But Greece couldn't inflate it. Greece, had to either get bailed out or default. With long-term debt, had only Greece issued a ton of long-term debt, there would have been bad news about their long-term surpluses and no financial crisis. All that would have happened is the price of long-term bonds would have fallen like a stone. And then there would have been problems further on, but they would have at least had those 10 years to figure out the problems. So long-term debt's a wonderful thing, and that's my main problem with the quantitative easing 2 program, is that we're getting rid of all of U.S. long-term debt, so that when it is discovered that, say, California has no money in its coffers, then we will face a rollover of short-term debt problem that leads to immediate inflation, rather than being able to let long-term bondholders, letting the Chinese take up the slack once again, as they have several times in the past. Equity is good. Long-term debt is almost like equity. They're great buffers. Let me see. I tried to condense a 10-week course into 1 hour. I'm doing actually a whole lot better than I thought I was going to be doing, but we're not going to do it all. I wanted to show you some policy issues, and let's think about let's use this framework to think about the policy issue of the moment. Are we going to face big inflation? What's going to happen if the U.S. doesn't solve its surplus problem? Now, by the way, already you can see when we think about what kind of deficits. Where's my favorite equation? I need one version of the equation. Here's the version of the equation to point to. Already, what is the danger for inflation? It is not this year's deficit. Much as I hate the stimulus program and thought it a waste of $1 trillion, I can't use this equation to really complain about it. What matters is the long-term deficits. And in the U.S., that's the resolving the entitlements dilemma. And the equation just points to you that's the problem to worry about. And in fact, here's just to get you scared. This is a horror movie for economists. Here comes the ghost. This is the debt to GDP ratio. This is the Congressional Budget Office's forecast of what's going to happen to the U.S. debt to GDP ratio. That's the one to watch. It's an old saying: if it's unsustainable, it can't happen. But the question is, do we get out of that by solving the problem, or do we get out of that with inflation? Well, let's use let's be our 2-year-old with a hammer, and what does our one equation say about sort of the policy choices of will debt lead to inflation? Well, there's our equation, quiz. Many people say don't worry about inflation because the debt to GDP ratio is under 100%. So there's some magic debt to GDP ratio where you get into trouble. I don't see any magic debt to GDP ratio in here. It's all about expected present value future surpluses. At the end of World War II, U.S. had like 150% debt to GDP ratio and not much inflation. Why? Well, because everybody understood the deficits were past, there was going to be good surpluses in the future, and therefore you're good for your debts. Conversely, you can have a low debt to GDP ratio, but if everybody understands you have a disaster in the future, then you're going to get inflation today. Another thing people say is don't worry about inflation. What will happen? Well, if inflation comes, first we'll wait for the Fed to have to monetize the debt. Then that seniorage will cause inflation by too much money chasing too many goods. Nope. Right? You can see, you can get inflation today. If you have, the problem is the deficit's 10 years from now, and the seniorage 10 years from now, that's ST plus 10, you get inflation today. Why? Everybody sees that coming and tries to get rid of the debt today. Getting rid of the debt today is inflation goes up today.
John?
Yes?
Sorry, as a humble microeconomist, I just learned 10 minutes ago that if you have long-term debt, that won't happen.
Right, but we don't have that much long-term debt.
Okay.
The average maturity structure of U.S. debt is about 2 years, so you get to use that equation for events over a 2-year, past a 2-year horizon. We are, in fact, running the world's biggest hedge fund and rolling over short-term debt.
So you could solve the problem if you increase long-term debt instead.
That would be lovely, but we've chosen not to do that. The discount rate can rise too. I mean, compounding our troubles, we benefit, or the U.S. benefits right now from a very low discount rate. The very low discount rate means people are willing to hold our debt, Chinese especially, despite some rather appalling present value, appalling future surpluses. Well, when the flight from U.S. debt comes, if the markets decide the U.S. is not going to solve its long-run entitlement problems, one of the things that's going to happen is we're going to lose our safe haven reserve currency status. Where do you put that in here? You put that in here on a higher R, and that compounds your problems. So the picture is a flight from the dollar. It happens quickly and unpredictably. So the markets decide the ST plus J isn't going to be there. They try to get rid of their short-term debt 10 years before the actual problem has. How would our beloved central bankers respond? Well, we saw at least how the ECB responded when all of the trouble that the Greece, Portugal, and so forth, when their interest rates went up, exactly this mechanism, they said, oh, it's the evil speculators and contagion and so forth, which is probably what our central bankers will say too. Because what are you looking at? You're seeing a rise in long-term rates and an inflation that seems to be coming from nowhere just because of expected present values and stuff. So that's, if we're going to solve this problem, we don't have a lot of time. You can't wait until the deficits show up. You can't wait until the inflation starts. The key is long-term deficits, and the answer to long-term deficits is long-term growth, really. We never pay off debts, we grow out of them. The last thought is, well, a lot of people think that maybe a little inflation would be a good thing. There's a Phillips curve. Maybe it would cancel some nominal debts. The Fed says don't worry about inflation. Also on Phillips curve logic, here's a quote from the FOMC. With substantial resource slack continuing to restrain cost pressures and long-term inflation expectations stable, inflation is likely to be subdued for some time. That's Bernanke, and that's the Fed. I mentioned the Fed view. Inflation comes from these Phillips curves, so don't worry. Now, is this a useful thing to think about? Let me remind you about Zimbabwe. It is not the richest country in the world. Despite abundant inflation, that didn't work. And despite plenty of resource slack, they have both unemployment and inflation. So both of these, a little inflation always being a good thing, and don't worry about inflation because we got unemployment, at least there's one data point that says that might be a bit of a problem. That's motivating me to think, and this is to remind you that Phillips curves don't work. So here's unemployment and inflation in the U.S. This is the 1970s through 1980s. Remember, Bernanke says, don't worry about inflation because we have plenty of resource slack. So, for example, in 1978, when unemployment was higher than it had ever been before, so we shouldn't really worry about inflation, right? Boom, 1980, up we go. Phillips curves shift. Here's the more recent Phillips curve we've seen from 84, This is just not present in this data. And in the recent recession, it's kind of interesting. Unemployment shot up with almost no effect on inflation. What I'm thinking about now is, let's take this seriously. Let's put something fiscal in a new Keynesian Phillips curve and try to think about the question, will this, I thought sort of frictionless so far, just where does the inflation come from? If we get inflation, does that come with a little bit of a boom, or does that come with a little bit of does that come with stagflation? We have Phillips curve theories to help us think about that. So one thing I've done is I've run through a little scenario, which I don't have time today to tell you how the whole scenario works. But the essence of it is a little calibration. Let's suppose there's a shock today. Today markets wake up and say, oh my God, those guys, those clowns, they're never going to solve the problem. I don't think of them clowns, actually. I think this is not going to happen. I think the U.S. is still a sane enough country, and we've got enough time, and it's so easy to fix our budget problem that they'll do it, that this won't happen. But suppose that's not true. Suppose markets wake up and say, give up on the U.S. This is an attempt to build a scenario. And in this scenario, there are things the Fed can do the opposite of a QE2 and delay the inflation. So in the scenario, we get a surplus shock today. Long-term debt can put this off for about 3 years, and then in 3 years we start seeing the inflation. What happens? Well, here I plotted bond prices. Of course, the bond market sees this coming. So the first thing that happens is you see long-term rates rising and all sorts of puzzles from the Fed about why long-term rates are rising. Then I fed this scenario through a new Keynesian model. So using the new Keynesian Phillips curve, where it goes right here, together with the fiscal theory to determine inflation is actually quite easy. It's much easier than the standard solution technique for new Keynesian Phillips curves. So because what I've done is I've already told you the path for inflation. We get the shock today, and then inflation is going to break out in 3 years. So there's inflation going up in 3 years. Our question is, what does that do to unemployment and to output? Do we get a boom or do we get a stagflation? Well, the game's up. And you kind of, once you think just a second about this is an expected inflation. So expected inflations don't generate output booms. Expected inflations are stagflations. We all kind of know what's coming. So what I did here is there's the new Keynesian Phillips curve. I just took this path for inflation, an inflation that breaks out in a couple of years, ran that through here to see what would happen to output. So here's output, and of course, since you have expected inflation, output goes down. This is a stagflation. I also ran through what happens to the interest rate. The interest rate is expected inflation plus the real rate. So here's the interest rate path. What would this look like? What this would look like is first the bond market goes nuts. And long-term rates go up. Then the inflation starts to break out along with stagnation. The Phillips curve shifts. Imagine yourself a poor central banker. Oh, the bond market's gone nuts. The speculators are sending long-term rates up. Then what happens is a mysterious output decline. We're getting stagnation. And then inflation starts to break out. And you, the central banker, here's the interest rates. And you can hear him, pulling out his hair in front of Congress. But we're being good boys. Right? Because we're raising interest rates more than 1-for-1 with inflation, just like we were supposed to see interest rates go up more than 1-for-1 with inflation. Inflation breaks out, driven by fiscal events in a way that the central bank is just powerless to control and powerless to understand if it thinks in terms of interest rate targets and stable Phillips curves. Because what happens if the Phillips curve shifted out? The expected inflation shifted out the Phillips curve. Well, that's a scenario. I hope it doesn't happen. What we've done today is I've introduced one little tool. The little tool is, where did it go? The value of nominal debt is the real value of nominal debt is the present value of future surpluses. And you can see how that tool goes a long way towards thinking about monetary events, the source of inflation, and provides a very different source of analysis from at least what you read in the newspapers. My challenge right now is taking that and making sense of policy and history with that tool. I mean, theory survives not if it's beautiful theory. Theory survives if it provides a good organizing framework for policy. Friedman didn't get MV equals PY on his license plate from theory. He got it from writing the history of the U.S. and the monetary history. Same with New Keynesians. They're successful because they're able to provide a framework that's useful for understanding data and for understanding policy. So if you find this interesting, there's things to read. I'm always, as future academics, always plug your work. My paper's on the topic, which you might find interesting. Understanding policy in the Great Recession is where I think about, through the fiscal framework, what happened, why did we get such a good recession, and these thoughts about, are we going to face fiscal inflation? That's all in there. The Money is Stock paper is an easy place to go start reading about the fiscal theory and how it works. Chris Sims' webpage is a place you could go spend months, and a good place to read about all these sorts of things. The new Keynesian model, I mentioned briefly why I didn't think it works. If you're curious about why I think the new Keynesian model is wrong, not the model, but their equilibrium selection device is wrong. That's a determination that's in that last paper. So just Google me if you're interested in that stuff. The end, no, it's not the end. As you can see, this is really just the beginning. We've done sort of a 1-hour class, but I think I've pointed to all sorts of ideas. None of these are worked out. Understanding inflation, deflation in the 70s is, I think, a very high event. Understanding currency collapses, they're almost all fiscal. There's a lot to do, and you just take any event or policy and try to think about it through these terms and see if it makes sense to you. So, thank you very much. More questions?